forum. I want to warmly welcome everybody to session 5 of our forum, which will discuss the topic of inclusive, resilient, and sustainable economies. This session is co-organized by ESCAP, ILO, UN Women, and UNEP. First, some brief housekeeping announcements. Please note that this forum is bilingual, English and Russian. You can select the language you want to listen to by clicking on the respective interpretation channel. On behalf of our interpreters, I want to inform you that our interpreters will alternate every 20 minutes. Speakers and participants are requested to be mindful of the additional difficulties experienced by interpreters when working in remote mode and of the increased likelihood of disruptions to the audio feed to the interpreters. Only the speech of the intervention in the original language constitutes an authentic record of the proceedings. Interpreters servicing remote meetings cannot be held liable for interruption of service, pixelation, freezing or loss of visual input, partial or complete loss of audio, audible artifacts, unauthorized access to personal or confidential data, leaking of information due to inadequate soundproofing, and/or data loss. Participants joining us on YouTube live stream can throughout the session post questions on the YouTube chat. Our colleagues will select and forward some of your questions to the moderator. Those questions we have no time to answer. We will answer in a summary format in writing later and post this onto the ESCAP forum webpage. With these housekeeping announcements out of the way, I now would like to give the floor to our moderator for this session, Mr. Hamza Ali Malik, Director, Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division of ESCAP. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for the introduction and for the basic housekeeping announcement. Good morning, colleagues from Bangkok, distinguished speakers, panelists, and ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this 5th session of the 4th North and Central Asian Multi-Stakeholder Forum on Implementation of the SDGs. The focus of this particular discussion in this session will be on socioeconomic recovery from the crisis that has been induced by COVID-19 pandemic in a manner that helps economies become inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. So let me just to set the scene and some sort of context and background, let me share a few slides, take about 5 minutes of your time, and before moving on to our main presenters. Thank you very much. Okay, next please. So as I said, as Natalia also shared, this is a session jointly organized by ESCAP, ILO, UN Women, and UNEP. And you will hear from our colleagues from these organizations very soon. Next, please. So that's the basic background slide that I'm sure you're familiar by now and must have seen in some other sessions. This is simply a summary of a snapshot of Sustainable Development Goals progress up until 2019 in North and Central Asia region across the goals. So the line in the middle, the solid black line, you can see countries should have crossed or reached that point by 2019 if they are to achieve the 2030 agenda or Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. As you can see, in several goals, countries have made good progress, they're on track, while in others, much more work is needed. So this is like the context that more work is needed. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So what we're going to focus here in this discussion actually is how the economic shock, the economic contraction induced by the COVID-19 pandemic will make the achievement of SDGs all the more difficult. This is the basic data for the last 50 years on GDP growth in the Asia-Pacific region. What I want you to draw, and I've drawn two sort of reference points. One is AFC, this is the Asian financial crisis of 97-98, and the GFC is the global financial crisis, the two major crises the region has seen in the last 20-25 years. I want you to pay attention to the green middle line or the blue line on the top, which is the developing countries of Asia and the Pacific. And all I want to highlight in this slide that the current pandemic may turn out to be the biggest crises as far as the GDP growth is concerned in the region. We saw a major decline both in 97 and 2008. However, so far, according to our preliminary estimates, this could be even bigger. So at the moment, according to SCAP forecast, we expect a contraction of about 1.8% in the Asia Pacific region's economies, just the developing countries, mind you. Next slide, please. And of course, our North and Central Asian region is no exception. They're experiencing the similar magnitude of GDP forecast. What you see here is the revisions in our forecasts since the last update we did in November 2019 and the latest one we did towards the end of July. So these gray bars actually are showing the scale and the degree of revisions we had to do because of the COVID-19 pandemic in our GDP estimates for 2020. The red dots are actually showing actual estimated or forecast GDP for 2020. As you can see, pretty much across the board or the region, countries are expecting a contraction, which is what we call it sometimes negative growth. And you can see the actual example of countries as well. There are a few examples which is hidden here. For instance, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan may experience some positive growth, but again, their growth estimates have been revised down considerably as well. Right? So that's the first main point. Significant economic contraction is expected in the region. Next slide, please. Of course, one of the implications of the COVID shock is the impact on the employment or job losses. It's a huge shock. I'm not going to dwell on this point a bit more anymore because I know my ILO colleagues will go in the details of that. All we are showing is between Q1 and Q2, there's a significant increase in unemployment or equal number of full job time losses or working hours that are lost. Next slide, please. So taken together, the economic contraction and job losses are likely to contribute significantly to the elevation or increase in poverty levels. So here I show you three different metrics that are traditionally used: $90 metric, $3.2, and 5.5. And again, you can see between April and even in June, there is now upward revisions or estimates that poverty may turn out to be much higher than we were expecting as early as April also, right? So economic contraction, significant job losses, and a potential significant increase in poverty levels. Next slide, please. There is one plus or upshot that I would just briefly want to mention. Of course, because of this reduced economic activity within countries and across the globe has given the environment some breathing space. This is just some indication to show that air quality actually has improved. If you look at the blue line, which is 2019, and red line, which is 2020. So in more or less, we see a significant change. Of course, those countries that open up for activity again, they've again seen the air quality matching the air quality of 2019. Next slide, please. So how have countries responded so far? Quite in an unprecedented manner, which is very appropriate for this kind of shock. All countries have rolled out significant fiscal packages. What we show on the left panel here is the Asia Pacific, for instance, on average has rolled out packages of close to 5% of their combined GDP. For North and Central Asian region, that figure is about 3.4. And this is just the median numbers. The range, as you can see, are in the gray bars. And again, you see on the right-hand panel, the actual data on countries, how much they have tried to support their economies through fiscal measures. These numbers are in percentage of GDP. So pretty significant economic packages. Although down the line, there are going to be consequences of that, for instance, in terms of rising debt levels and how to sustain this kind of expansionary momentum. But that's a question we're going to discuss with the panelists. Next slide, please. So it's not only been fiscal policy measures, a host of monetary measures have been introduced. For instance, central banks have lowered interest rates. You can see significantly in some cases. Next slide, please. And other monetary policy measures have been introduced. For instance, support to provide liquidity. Range of instruments have been used. Lowering required reserve ratios, setting up financing facilities, loan financing, cut refinancing rates, so also, and lowering liquidity ratios, for instance, and continuing. And central banks, next slide, please. And central banks have also supported and targeted areas, for instance, direct support to small and medium enterprises. So in addition to lowering interest rates for them, they have introduced interest and principal repayment deferrals, expand loan facilities for the SME sector, provide support to that sector. Next slide, please. So before I conclude, I just want to make you two observations. When we start thinking and discussing about how to recover. One is the reminder from the history. So again, referring back to Asian financial crisis and global financial crisis, the two pictures that you see. The dotted straight line that you see is the GDP trend that should have been there had there been no crisis of 1997. But you see the actual line, the green line that is below the dotted line, that is the actual GDP. The point here is simple. Once a shock of this magnitude hits, GDP goes down and remains below the potential or remains below the targeted levels or the trend levels. So the chances that we can recover and go back to our pre-COVID-19 levels is very slim if you look at these crises, Asian financial crisis and global financial crisis here. Next slide, please. So the message I want to give here for the participants is pay attention. So paying attention only to recover GDP growth is not going to be enough. You cannot go back. That's what history teaches us. We need to pay attention to the quality of that recovery. And that's what we're talking about here, how to ensure resilient, inclusive, and sustainable recoveries. Here's another point, and the likelihood that the history is going to repeat is because the policy space has become quite limited. So what you see on the left-hand panel, for instance, is simply comparing the policy rate of central banks end of 2007 and end of 2019. And the dotted line is the 45-degree line. So most countries are below the 45-degree line, which simply means back in 2007, they had higher interest rate, which means that policy space to lower them further to support their economies was much more. Now is not the case. Same is true for once you look at beginning of 2020 and end July. And again, even end of beginning of 2020, space was a bit more in terms of cutting interest rates than as is the case right now. So further support coming from the central banks in terms of lowering rates would be difficult. Next slide, please. And same is the case for fiscal side. You can see the debt in this figure, and the next one actually shows the expected fiscal positions. So the red bars are actually showing the fiscal balance in the region on average before and after the crisis. So you can see the average in these black dotted lines. So you look at the 97 crisis, for instance. Before the crisis, the average was around 1.5%. After that, it went to 2.5%. Similarly, around 2008 crisis, countries were in a far better position because their fiscal position was very good. And then after the crisis, they had to step up expansionary policies. The question now, of course, is because before the 2020 pandemic, they're already starting at a very relatively high fiscal balance level. So chances are it's going to go up considerably higher is very, very big. Next slide, please. So that's all I wanted to highlight with you guys, with the participants here. And let me share some broad questions which we articulated in the concept note as well. So the question for discussion should be broadly, when we think about how to engineer resilient, inclusive, and sustainable development or recoveries, can and for how long the countries in the North and Central Asian regions sustain the momentum of expansionary policies, both on the fiscal and monetary side, without having adverse implications? One of them, of course, is potential challenges for the public debt. Other key question is how to finance the needed spending. So not only have to finance the spending to recover from the crisis, but we also have to finance the achievement of sustainable development goals. So how to finance that enormous investment requirement? That's another important question to think about. Next slide, please. And what policy tools and changes we should consider as we talk about recovery in the sense of making the recovery resilient, inclusive, and sustainable, keeping in line with the ambitions of 2030. And then zeroing in a little bit more on these Central Asian economies features. So how can the Central Asian economies accelerate their structural economic transformation and diversification to not only promote economic dynamism and employment, but also, again, that promotes inclusiveness and respects the planetary boundaries. So these are the broader themes I wanted to touch base here in the intro remarks. Let me now move on to our distinguished panelists, presenters first. So we have actually a very good range of speakers. So let me start with Mr. Ramiro Pizarro, who will be talking. He's a project manager with the ILO office for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. He'll be talking about the COVID-19 in the world of work. So I just showed you basic numbers about impact of COVID on the employment. I'm sure he'll share further insights. So Mr. Ramiro Pizarro, the floor is yours, sir.
Good morning to everyone. My presentation is about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the world of work. Looking forward to economic strategies that can deliver an inclusive job rich recovery as a way of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The core part of my presentation will be the strategic policy framework developed by the ILO as part of the political response to the COVID-19 in order to ensure an inclusive and sustainable employment. Why are we focusing the world of work? Because the COVID-19 pandemic, as has been mentioned, has turned into an employment crisis of unprecedented scope and scale. The crisis has a human face. The ILO Centenary Declaration calls for a human-centered response. Please, slide 1. If you can move to slide 1, please. Regardless where they live, workers and their families lack income support and social protection to keep them from falling into poverty. The International Labour Organization warned at an early stage that only by balancing support for enterprise on the one hand with support for workers and their family on the other hand, will government be able to address properly the crisis human dimension. Several transmission mechanisms have amplified the employment crisis. Supply chain disintegrate, whole sector collapse, and enterprise close or are on the verge of bankruptcy. Especially most vulnerable micro and small enterprise. More and more workers face the prospect of unemployment and lost income and livelihood. But the crisis has had different impact on enterprise, on workers, on their family, though in each case deepening already existing disparities. The ILO calls for special attention to the following group: women, informal economy workers, young workers, older workers, migrant workers, and micro-entrepreneurs and the self-employed, particularly those operating in the formal economy. Just a few words about the North and Central Asia vulnerabilities. Please, slide 2. I think slide 2. Please. We have been a very good quantitative analysis in the opening of this section. Yes, I will stress a few ideas. Disruption in trade and along global supply chain have had a negative effect on developing economies such as North and Central Asia, even before the lockdown were extended. The falling commodity price worldwide weakened exporting countries' trade position even further and reduce employment in importing sector, which in turn drive fiscal revenue down. Capital outflows, decreasing export, and remittance have led to currency devaluation, making debt servicing and the importing of food and medical supply more expensive, all of which put additional pressure on developing countries' fiscal balance. The effect on enterprise, job, and income are more severe in the region, given that workers in North and Central Asia already enjoy less protection and have lower income. Moreover, these countries are characterized by weak employment and social protection system, amplifying labor market vulnerabilities, and by the fact that a large share of jobs and small medium enterprise are in the informal economy. What is the ILO response to this challenge? Please, slide 3. In response to the ILO COVID-19 crisis, the ILO calls for immediate support to enterprise and worker across 4 pillars. stimulating the economy and employment, supporting enterprise, job and income, protecting workers in the workplace, and relying on social dialogue for solutions. The ILO policy framework is based on international labor standards. Key provisions ensure worker protection while employers and government are adjusting to the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic. This standard contribute to a culture of social dialogue and workplace cooperation, key for a sustainable recovery and prevent a deterioration in employment and labor conditions. The ILO standard guide a wide range of areas covered by the 4 strategic pillars and provide a pathway for achieving the Sustainable Development Goal, especially the Goal 8, promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. The Pillar 1 is about stimulating the economy and employment. In the opinion also was stressed that timely and coordinated implementation of fiscal and monetary policies prevent people from losing job and income and companies from suffering bankruptcy and facilitate a sustainable recovery. Accommodative monetary policies enable government to adjust their fiscal policies in support of the economy, making large amount of public resources available to enterprise, workers, and households to help them to overcome the immediate negative impact of the economic crisis, but also to boost domestic demand. The second pillar is about supporting enterprise, job, and income. This is an essential component to contain and redress the economic and social crisis. Small medium enterprise, financial and tax relief measures still play a vital role both in the immediate response to the crisis and in the medium term by propelling a sustainable and resilient recovery. Most effective employment measures to preserve existing jobs and support workers are administered and financed through the National Unemployment Insurance System, often supplemented by resources from the general government budget. Other countries are using the social assistance system for supporting the loss of worker income, as either a lump sum or as percentage of a worker's salaries, or for rolling out cash transfer for informal workers. What is important here is support to workers depend on the country's social protection system and the strength of unemployment and insurance program. In both cases, the crisis has drawn attention once again to the importance of ensuring universal access to employment and social protection systems that provide comprehensive and adequate benefit meeting worker needs, which are an essential component for a quicker and sustainable economic recovery. The Pillar 3 is about protecting workers in the workplace. Most of the workers who have been on the front line of the response to the crisis, providing essential service, do not have access to safety and health programs. Almost 50% of the global labor force have no legal entitlement to sickness benefit. These workers must choose between staying at home when they are sick to protect their own health or to continue working to maintain their job and income, thereby placing their own and other health at risk. Immediate measures to expand access to sickness benefit are therefore urgently needed. Strengthening occupational safety and health, providing access to health care and paid sick leave are indispensable components of a coordinated health, social, and economic policy response to the crisis. Finally, the Pillar 4 is relying on social dialogue for solutions. Social dialogue involving government and employers and worker organizations is more important than ever. It includes all types of negotiation, consultation, and exchange of information between or among representatives of government, workers, and employers on issues of common interest in the areas of economic, labor, and social policy. It can take place at the national, sectoral, or enterprise level. Bipartite dialogue between employers and workers' organizations and tripartite social dialogue with the government build economic resilience by designing solutions tailored to the specific need of an industry, sector, or enterprise. Social dialogue on worker conditions, safety and health, employment protection, and job retention measures protect workers, but at the same time support business continuity. How this policy can be translated here in the region in a national employment policy for an inclusive job-rich recovery. Please, the final slide, slide 4. Slide 4. As some containment measures have been relaxed, many countries have embarked on the return to work and opening up workplace. However, tackling the employment crisis called for a careful policy sequencing, as economic recovery is not a linear process, but one that will involve many changes and adaptation. Firstly, moving from the immediate response to the health crisis toward a stage where the virus has been contained and normal activity slowly resumed implies reactivating the economy and getting people back to work with some protection measure in place. Secondly, a job-rich recovery requires a medium and long-term vision on how to develop an employment-intensive or labor demand-led economic strategy. This strategy should include promoting employment creation in strategic sectors, restoring a conducive business environment and productivity growth, diversifying the economy, encouraging structural transformation, and making best use of technological advance. A stimulus measure through monetary and fiscal policy remain critical. But to ensure that the stimulus is translated into greater domestic demand and not only more imports, measures to improve national supply chain and national infrastructure are much needed, together with targeted policy for new and growing sectors where employment opportunity for women and youth will come from. Implementing public work programs across labor-intensive sectors help to support business continuity, to save jobs, and mitigate the contraction of the private sector. In developing countries, support to formal enterprise must be executed alongside measures to help micro and small enterprise in the informal sector as they create most of the new jobs. Funding should also be made available for strong active labor market programs, promoting a youth-inclusive, a gender-responsive employment recovery. Greater investment in women and young worker skills, job search assistance, labor intermediation, and labor counseling are needed to facilitate the replacement, relocation, or employment in the sector that are quickly recovering or expanding and creating new jobs. Informally economic workers who fall outside the scope of labor law and social protection are particularly vulnerable. Coordinated employment and social protection programs help to facilitate the transition from the informal job and enterprise to the formal economy. Finally, the crisis made clear the importance of an enhancing coordination between social protection and employment policies. Social assistance, cash transfer, food delivery, and income support keep people out of poverty. Employment policies help to move people from social assistance to the labor market. In addition to saving working life, these policies have a positive macroeconomic impact, supporting aggregate demand and consumption, helping to stabilize and reactivate the economy toward a job-rich recovery. Many thanks for your attention.
Many thanks, Mr. Ramiro Pizarro, to you for a very succinct yet comprehensive presentation. I really like your observation on the fact that economic recovery actually is not a linear process. Governments and policymakers need to emphasize not only just economic recovery and economic growth, they have to have a focus on employment and then go beyond that in the sense of addressing the concerns of vulnerable groups, investing in skill development, helping the transition of from informal to formal sectors, and most importantly, strengthening the links between social protection and employment. And I think I fully agree with your observation that at the moment, fiscal policy is not aligned with the social protection importance, and governments need to invest further in that. That will allow resilience, that will promote inclusiveness, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Let me now move on to the next presenter. May I request Ms. Lesia Nikolaeva, Technical Officer, Resource Efficiency Unit, from the UNEP Europe Office, United Nations Environment Programs Europe Office. She will be talking about green economic recovery, how to focus on sustainability aspects of economic recovery. So, Ms. Leia Nikolaeva, the floor is yours, madam.
Спасибо, господин Малик, за предоставленное слово. Меня зовут...
I thank you, Mr. Malik. My name is Lesa Nikolaeva. I am with the European office of UNEP, which is based in Geneva. And the onset of my presentation, I want to thank for having me at this forum for UNEP. It's a big honor to become a co-organizer of the meeting and to participate in this multi-stakeholders forum. From my side, very briefly, I would like to give you summary UNEP positions for building back better and greening the recovery packages after COVID-19. And I would like to change my slide, and now I would like to have the next one, please. Yes. Before this year, UNEP provided its own view on how to deal with environment in order to protect people for the sake of COVID-19 response and how to help the nations to recover after the pandemic in order to boost resilience in the future to crisis. And this review should be reviewed in the context of the UN generally report on social and economic repercussions of COVID-19 and what should be done in terms of making immediate measures to respond on COVID-19. In this framework, UNEP will coordinate its activities with the other UN system in order to support member states to include environmental aspects into their corresponding response measures. The UNEP role is to introduce this environmental and sustainable component into the recovery measures after the pandemic. Mainly, here UNEP will be focused on such directions as trade and cooperation between trade representatives and environmentalist campaigners, including multi-stakeholder approach between state and non-state sectors in order to overcome the world economic crisis with the help of stimuli packages and budget reforms which are more environmentally oriented and sustainable. At the same time, in terms of creating green vacancies, we try to support the nations in terms of supporting sustainable production and consumption and providing equal and just transition of sectors and the employers in terms of protecting the most vulnerable groups, which are more vulnerable to COVID-19 and hence helping them transition to more sustainable economics. Fiscal stimuli and financial packages are also important to secure SDGs implementation, and management of the waste is another important thing. Slide number 3, please. Okay. Here, I would like to demonstrate 4 responses on behalf of UNEP to COVID-19, and more details will be given on response number 3, which is mostly matched with the topic of our ongoing session on sustainable and inclusive economy. So response number 1 is the stage of providing medical and humanitarian emergency support. Due to bad impact on human health and environment, which originated from many sources. We are talking about a sudden surge of wastes such as spent PPEs, disinfectant, and antimicrobial liquids, which boosts the level and the volume of this waste in the environment. And the UNEP focus here is to raise awareness on how to deal with these medical wastes, with this biological waste and PPEs waste in terms of how to manage this waste with the most focus on resource efficacy and recycling. And also, UNEP will be focused on country assessment of capacity for medical waste management, as well as political and legal framework on waste management associated with COVID-19, and respective development legislation in terms of new approach for medical waste associated with COVID-19 and spreading this information among the country member states. Response number 2 will be focused on a transformational change for nature and people. Here, the main goal is to underscore this link in terms of infection or risks transmission from human to animal. And the most important thing here is to promote protection, environmental protection, and ecosystems protection in order to make them more resilient once we would face similar challenges as COVID-19, and also how to protect biodiversity as a result of depriving habitat for endangered species due to agricultural expansion and exploitations of species, which of course creates new risks for pandemics in the future. So response number 2 is to improve political and scientific capacities for better understanding of these links and risks associated with them and how to respond. On the slide number 4, here I would like to dwell more on response number 3, on how UNEP could help with response measures on COVID-19 for building back better, greening the recovery packages. Environmental component of recovery would boost the resilience in front of the possible future crisis to support human health status and protecting environment, and protection for green jobs will be very important through additional investments and boosting social and environmental infrastructure, which is a prerequisite for sustainable production and responsible climate stability.
Is within that time. Thank you.
Спасибо. В рамках ответа
Thank you. In the framework of response number 3, we will be focusing on supporting the governments to rebuild the next generation of social, ecological, and productive infrastructure, as well as attracting businesses and economic organizations to recover and speeding up sustainable production and building up and creating new green jobs. Also linking recovery efforts with the clean energy transition and nature-based solutions, and in the context of the Paris Accord. On the slide number 5, can you have slide number 5, please? Next slide, please. We will demonstrate some platforms for cooperation at regional and national levels. UNEP is a participant of inter-organizational coalition on environmental and climate change for Europe and Central Asia on behalf of the UN, as well as from the very beginning of the pandemic. UNEP is closely cooperating with country UN teams and resident coordinators in the countries to agree on joint actions for a post-COVID-19 recovery. Next slide, please. Here on this slide, I could give you some examples how UNEP operates with the Central and Northern Asia states in order to promote ideas for sustainable consumption and production, as well as along with the green economy principles. This platforms is the 10th framework program on sustainable production and consumption, where we have 6 different sub-programs on various sectors. And another important tool is a partnership for action on a green economy page, which is currently implementing in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan in the Central Asian region. And the most focus here is on such sectors as developing environmentally friendly way of waste management, and we in particular supporting Kazakhstan to develop national waste management program. We also support Kyrgyzstan on developing economic and regulatory mechanisms in the waste management area. Then number 3 is the sustainable public procurement program, along with the finance ministry of various Central Asian states. We're promoting this idea on how through governmental procurement we could make business more green, respectively the products they're producing, making more green, and to produce more energy efficient products with the component of environment sustainability, produce more green products and provide them to the government through public procurement. On the next slide, I would like to give you some actions, articles, blogs, and webinars which UNEP within this whole period.
Их перечень и большое
We can see the list of these countries, and a big number of reports were produced to support countries so that environmental component or dimension would be included into recovery measures and response measures, and take into consideration the fact that, first of all, countries would recover and return back to the market environmental aspects or economic aspects. They have to take into consideration the environmental aspect and how they're going to obtain positive effects in the future if their measures are aimed from the very start at sustainable development and production. Thank you very much for your participation and wish productive work to all of you today at session number 5. Thank you very much and have good luck.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nikolaeva, for highlighting the very obvious challenge. I think even before the COVID, climate change was far bigger challenges, posed far bigger challenges for economies across the globe. Environment, people have been acknowledging the subject and issues, the importance of sustainable consumption and production, how to go about doing that, the 10-year framework that you referred to. All those things have been in place, and not enough action has been taken globally, to be honest. So thank you very much for bringing again to the attention. I think what we are suggesting here is, let's use it as an opportunity now when we talk about Build Back Better. Now is the time when we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. We should also now bring back a challenge, a crisis that have been in the making for years, and already most people are pretty much familiar with that. So thank you very much for your presentation. Let me move to the last presenter before we move to our panelists. For this now, I would like to invite Ms. Nergis Azizova. She's with the Intergovernmental Partnership, Normative and Knowledge Management Specialist at UN Women, Regional Office for Europe and Central Asia. And of course, she'll be talking about gender-responsive socioeconomic recovery and sustainable development goals. Our first speaker also highlighted the importance of a targeted approach. So, Ms. Azizova, the floor is yours.
Спасибо большое. Я хотела бы начать с...
Thank you very much. I would like to start with the Hamza's citations, who said that the situation was very difficult prior to the crisis. So we are facing the issues prior to the pandemic. And I would like to talk about that in my presentation. I would like to ask to go to the next slide, please. Of course, it's quite understandable that the pandemic deteriorates, deepening pre-existing inequalities and all the vulnerabilities that used to be in the society. But the pandemic, regrettably, struck the most vulnerable groups that we have been talking about for many years when we were adopting 2030 agenda. So these are vulnerable migrants, refugees, women, older persons, persons with disabilities, and so on. But today we are facing a regress or limited availability for progress on the SDGs, specifically in poverty and hunger elimination. But we do understand that the progress that we were expecting in promoting gender equality and access to decent labor were regrettably affected by the pandemic. At the same time, we do understand that the agenda that we defined several years ago, many years ago, and we are striving at to just achieve by 2030 SDG action plan or program is allow a roadmap for us. So this is the only agenda which is agenda sensitive in our point of view, from our point of view. Therefore, all the measures that we expect from new plans in terms of economic recovery, in terms of social sphere recovery, have to be underpinned by the needs reflected in the SDGs. I would like to provide for you results of the discussion. Like 2 days ago, UN Secretary General met young women activists who were talking about the progress in the field of SDG and promoting gender equality. And he mentioned that today, risks are very high that we're going to lose not only several years of achievements, but several generations of achievements in the field of gender equality. Regrettably, all the figures and the analysis that we have from UN part show that these are risks of regress. Next slide, please. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we conducted, last year, we conducted a big review on achieving gender equality and implementation Beijing plus 25. And that process allowed us to review the challenges and issues that had existed after the 25 years of Beijing platform implementation. Regrettably, in no sphere of Beijing agenda we achieved the goals that we set 25 years ago. So that was informal employment, access to decent labor. The share of informal employment is still rather high in our region, including Central Asia. So in general, it's about like 43%. So you do understand that this sector, and we are from this region, and we understand that this sector has a very clear gender divide. So women are well represented in this sector. Regrettably, one slide is missed, but I would like to draw your attention to the fact that in addition to what we have, to the gender the gender divide that we have in informal sector, there are such issues as sectoral divides. In Central Asia, we are facing rather difficult situation in agricultural sector. A big number of, or big share of women that work who work informally in this sector, and we have such a segment of people who like household workers, meaning without any social protection, without any registration. And I would like to draw your attention for ILO report. ILO just conducted very big analysis back in 2018 in terms of access to labor, and the big block was considering non-paid labor, like children care, elderly care, sick people care, household work. And ILO said 2 years ago that in order to eliminate the existing gender divide in the field of household work, with the existing measures, 200 years will be required. We do understand that the situation is quite difficult, and the pandemic demonstrated that in this sector, in the care sector, we need to look at the measures, to address the measures in a radical way. So we need revolutionary or innovative measures in the care field. And in our region, back in May and June, we conducted a rapid gender assessment, as we call it, for the situation in the field of which are important for men and women, and how what effect had COVID on the situation, and what measures are taken by the governments of our countries in order to find solutions out of the situation. And at the very beginning, measures that were taken by the government, of course, just brought their positive effect because they were taken immediately. They were aimed at the part of the population that was immediately struck by the pandemic. We're talking about employment sectors, so service sectors, that suffered due to quarantine and lockdown measures, and we're talking about the social sectors where we had faced issues and concerns prior to the pandemic, and they were deteriorated during the pandemic. Today, now you see the three countries here: Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. In Azerbaijan, more than 70,000 people have lost their job.
may I request you to kindly slow down a little bit. Our translators need to catch up with you. So please slow a little bit.
Окей,
You still have
спасибо.
about 5 minutes, so you can convey your key message.
Я
Thank you.
извиняюсь очень сильно.
Beg your pardon? Thank you very much. In Azerbaijan, more than 70,000 people have lost their jobs, and so measures were taken accordingly, and they got compensation from the government in order to cover their just the salaries. In Kazakhstan, there was quite a relevant measure and timely measure when the government supported the people, and all the credits and loans payments were deferred. But there are situations and countries where such measures did not bring this kind of result. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, 47% of women businesses suffered, and 13% of businesses had to terminate their activities. We do understand the effects not only for women, but for the families that they supported. Next slide, please. So that fast gender assessment was conducted in May in 10 countries, and it was expanded even more. But I would say that it confirmed again the vulnerability of the groups that was mentioned by on the first day of the forum by UNESCAP colleague. So this is the slide from UNESCAP presentation, which shows who are the most vulnerable group of population: informal workers, seasonal workers, or freelance workers, labor migrants. And I would say that for Central Asia, so this is quite a relevant issue and quite a difficult situation, because the majority of the migrants had to return back to their countries. And regrettably, it was not possible just to compensate for the losses that their families and households incurred when they were not were not supported by the labor migrants. And the number of the labor migrants who just stayed in Russia, who returned from Russia, Kazakhstan, and other countries is quite significant to have a negative effect on the situation that we are facing now. That means like shrinking of wages, remittances, impossibility to find jobs in a quarantine regime. And of course, that all deteriorated vulnerability and lack of population safety. And of course, the category that did not work during a long period of time, so it's quite difficult for them to find jobs and to have access to the finance sources that are provided by the government for the people who are unemployed. Next slide, please. We also looked at the areas where the response measures were taken by the government. For example, as far as informal sector of economy is concerned, of course, response measures were taken in the field of social safety nets, aimed at those who were informally employed. But we would say that regrettably, the coverage of the population, of the people in need, was not fully covered, because was not fully implemented, because a lot of people were found as those attributed to the category of in high need, and so they had to be supported financially immediately. The second measure that was taken by the countries is social assistance through cash transfers. Some of them were conditional, some of them were not, or so were unconditional. So at some period of time, some
your messages, please, and kindly again.
Okay, thank you.
And the next big area, which is associated with non-paid household work, certain measures were taken to pay for like sick leaves or provide some cash for the services provided by the household members to take care of other family members. May we go to the next slide, please? we just wanted to, so I would like just to go to the next slides because I'm just lack of time, but I would like to focus on 2 issues. So the lessons learned from the pandemic showed that we have 2 big priorities that we have to pay our attention. So the first one is visualization in all spheres. So we do understand that the quarantine and lockdown measures showed all the achievements and advantages that we have in case of our population has access to such services as ICT, and if they have skills to use visualization. Of course, these layers of population were more adapted to the conditions of lockdown and the pandemic, and had a possibility to somehow extend their employment, education, and so on and so forth.
Прежде всего на ту проблему, которую имеет.
We believe we have to pay attention on the gender gap, and in this sector, women are less represented as the users and as employers. So that is why we have to make more sensible the gender representation of this sector, which will be beneficial for men, women, and economics in general. The second area is about financial stimulus packages. We talked a lot, and we will talk a lot about this. However, there is one specificity where we have to pay attention, that the package of these measures had been already tested in the region positively, but more importantly, how to invest with a greater efficiency on the care sector, because it is not only beneficial for those who are in need of care, but it also creates more vacancies. Yesterday, my colleague spoke about Kyrgyzstan, where they had costing in terms of cost assessment once we will develop care sector, and what will be the benefits of it.
It's over. If you have any last message, key message you want to say in 20-30 seconds, I can let you have that last word.
Окей, 30 секунд, тогда последний.
Okay. Final word regarding investments into education and new skills. Understandable that this sector, where we have a big gender gap in Central and Northern Asia, we have big figure from the World Bank that about 7 million students could drop out from secondary and tertiary education once the reforms will not be efficient in this area. That is why, if this would be a reality, mostly vulnerable would be women and young ladies, because that is the category of people who has limited access to education, which is based on patriarchal norms and cultural rights in the sector of education. I am wrapping up and would like to underscore that new measures for COVID recovery should be supported by investments, but education and care sector would be a very good opportunities to beef up our economy and give more chances for employment. Of course, this should be supported with the information technologies. On fiscal measures, we have representatives of other UN family organizations, but we could provide gender assessment to meet demands of men and women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Azizova, for trying to conclude in the things. My apologies again for intervening, but we have a very comprehensive set of. May I request Ms. Azizova to kindly mute your mic, please? There's an echo because of that. Thank you very much. So as I was saying, thank you very much for bringing to our notice. My first slide also had the same point. Not enough progress has been made on gender equality goal, sustainable development goals. So thanks for bringing it to the attention for the audience and then sharing a range of policies that can be pursued, are being pursued, and where UN Women is supporting. We have a very distinguished list of panelists now available to shed further light on these presentation and respond to some of the questions. Let me move to that segment now, and let me request them just to make a small housekeeping announcement, just to reiterate the message to facilitate the panelists. Please click on the request to speak blue button on the right side of the bottom of your Kudo page and wait until your request is approved. Once your request is approved, your microphone and cameras will be off by default. So you will need to actually see these as the two red buttons next to each other in the middle part or lower part of your screen. Please click on them to turn on your microphone and video on, and then you'll be able to participate and speak. All right. In the meantime, I'll also request our participants through the YouTube channel to organize their questions that they may have to the presenters or the panelists that we'll be addressing right now. So I have the honor to invite the first panelist, and kindly may I request a panelist, because to keep some time for later interactive discussion, question answer session, to limit your initial remarks, messages to 2 to 3 minutes, and later on, depending on the questions that emerge, and if we have time, we will come back to you for further observations. Thank you very much for your understanding. So let me now first turn to Mr. Bahodir Umurzakov, the Deputy Minister of Employment and Labor Relations, Uzbekistan. Mr. Umurzakov, you must have heard by now the importance of employment and power. So generating productive and decent work, in particular for women and young women and men, has been a challenge. And this has been not just the case for Uzbekistan, for many countries in the region, and that was a case even before the COVID-19 crisis. So with the economy crisis now, what are the government strategies regarding employment generation, particularly for the youth? The floor is yours, sir.
Спасибо, уважаемый господин Хамза Али Малик.
Thank you, distinguished Mr. Hamza Malik. This is a very big honor to me to participate in this forum, and I would like to answer the questions versus pandemic. And in terms, first of all, in terms of boosting employment opportunities and how to turn around the negative trend on significant shrink of income level. We're talking about the 8 SDGs on decent job and employment. That is why here we have 4 directions which we pick up as a priority for Uzbekistan. First, decisive measures on shrinking unemployment rate. We have a negative impact as all other countries due to COVID. If at the very beginning of this year we had 9.9% of unemployment rate, but currently we have 14.6% of unemployment. And of course we know the reasons of it. Second, promoting productive rate and employment for young individuals and women in particular. Uzbekistan, for the first time in its history, pick up the so-called iron notebook, where we put down the priority groups of population which should be trained and employed. This significantly help us to alleviate poverty. Next is transfer from informal to formal employment, and for the first time we adopted a program on stage-by-stage transition from informal to formal employment. Here we have Ministry of Labor in charge, as well as tax authorities, and we also have the local governments or Ministry on Makala. Makala is a local community in Uzbekistan. And the fourth point is providing a conducive environment for labor migration. Here we have many orders by the president and bylaws, but we would like to have more conducive environment for labor migrants to go abroad and find employment there. For this, in all cities of Russian Federation, where we have a lot of labor migrants in 8 big cities of Russia, we established our representation offices. And more importantly, we also try to find out the demand on our labor in terms of what professions are mostly demanded in Russian Federation and other countries, and that is why we try to train our migrants and secure them with labor contracts before sending them abroad. We also train, retrain them in terms of their rights, and we paid for their transportation to the countries of destination in order to give them decent opportunities to be employed and make sure that their household environment is also good. Another important thing before wrapping up, we decided to define the issue for new job opportunities. Currently, the reporting system should be improved on new jobs, and within 2 or 3 months, we would like to conclude important legislation associated with the new jobs, and new jobs are registered and organized including with the ILO requirements in order to make these new jobs decent, in order to make them safe. And another important part is education, and here we managed to realize that almost 80% of our workers do not have the ILO standard educational level and proficiency skills. That is why in all our branches we try to establish the so-called career centers, and we would like to train and retrain 50,000 people on all types of labor and professions. And I believe under the pandemic, this would be quite an important step in terms of providing additional labor opportunities to our people. Thank you for your attention. I'm ready to participate in the panel discussions.
Mr. Omarzakov, for sharing a range of policies that have been there, talking about skill development, addressing the concerns of migration from informal to the formal sector, new job opportunities, and so on and so forth. So I hope the panelists or participants were taking note, and if we have questions, we may come back to you for further observations and insights. Let me now move to the next panelist, and I have the honor to invite Ms. Asilia Isakova. She is the head of the Legal Expertise Division of the Public Procurement Department under the Ministry of Finance of the Kyrgyz Republic. So, Ms. Asilia, from Ms. Lesia Nikolaeva's presentation, we heard that recovery has to be green. We have to pay attention to environmental concerns. And she shared a range of policies and actions that are going on. In Kyrgyzstan, how can public procurement contribute to a green COVID-19 recovery, and how low carbon and resilient long-term development can be achieved in your opinion? The floor is yours, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Mr. Malik. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. First of all, I would like to thank you for having me at this session number 5. At the beginning, very briefly, I would like to talk about repercussions of COVID-19 and how it has an impact on state procurement in particular. And further on, I will an answer on your question regarding how to make our economy more green and lower carbon. As you know,
Limit of 2 to 3 minutes in view, please, at this round. And if you have time, we can further come back to you for further details. Observations, 2 to 3 minutes only. Thank you.
Можете еще... Так, хорошо, я тогда отвечаю на вопрос.
Okay, then I will just answer the question. Kyrgyz Republic supports a transfer to green economy, and the governmental procurement sector is one of the tools for such transition and for the measures for sustainable development. Through sustainable procurement, we are planning to provide stimulus for businesses and incentives for business so that they produce greener products at the market and deliver to the market, and so this would be less energy intense process, and they would create new jobs. When we are talking about the recovery of the economy in the aftermath of crisis of COVID-19, so it's important to implement this kind of measures. And Kyrgyzstan has adopted the governmental resolution, the program for green economy, and one of the components of this program envisages green procurements. We think that this can be a good example and incentives for enterprises to produce green products. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very succinct first round of observations, focusing on the one sector energy in this case. Let me continue down the line. We have several other participants, panelists. May I now request Mr. David Advadze, the Acting Head of Division of Sustainable Development, Ministry of Economy and Sustainable Development of Georgia. So, Mr. David, with fiscal space diminished and immediate needs on government budget increased, what is Georgia's strategy to achieve the SDGs? And what are the biggest hurdles in successfully implementing the strategy in your view? You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Welcome to everybody. I will try to put in nutshell, so to say it's very difficult to be very precise because in 3 minutes, but I will try to tell the situation in Georgia about this COVID-19 and the economic situation in the country. The world has changed dramatically as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. The economic crisis driven by the pandemic is like no other crisis, and of course Georgia is not exception, and the pandemic has interrupted Georgia's positive economic trajectory as well. The most important channel through which Georgia economy will be affected by the COVID-19 outbreak is tourism and business travel. Tourism represents one of the fastest growing industry in Georgia in recent years, and its share in economy was around 11.5%. the government introduced economic support package that includes various fiscal, monetary, financial, structural, social, and business support measures, which will support private sector and improve social safety nets. The initial support measures included the postponement of property and income taxes for tourists and related sectors, delay bank loans payments for entrepreneurs and citizens for 3 months, provision of interest subsidy to small and medium-sized hotels. Besides, government fully covered utility payment for 3 months for vulnerable households. Afterward, government presented a more targeted and comprehensive economic support package that also envisages sectoral policy measures and post-COVID recovery actions together with needed activities to strengthen social safety nets. The pace of social support measures envisages social assistance to employed people who lost their job over the course of 6 months, one-time assistance of self-employed or employed in informal sector. Under the framework of economic support package, state support program will become more targeted and oriented at most vulnerable and official and affected economic sectors, including tourist sector. In order to address challenges related to COVID-19 outbreak, together with above mentioned policy measures, we are trying to utilize new opportunities currently unfolding globally. Georgia is a destination through which businesses will be able to cut operational costs, be logistically closer, enter priority market without tariffs, and minimize their risk related to the current and future crisis. Accordingly, we have identified over 400 companies worldwide that will be eager to approach and negotiate their potential interest in the country. In the way, we are more open and ready for business than we have ever been before. The government has presented
May I interrupt? My apologies. We have to move to the next panelist, and we wanted to get the first round of your observations so the participants can actually take note and ask you questions if they want to follow up. So you shared some of the major. If you're going to have a last word, please go ahead.
Okay. The next sector that will receive special support is agriculture, the biggest employer in the country. Specific support package for agriculture sector envisages direct support for farmers and cooperatives via grants and vouchers. And last but not least, I would like to emphasize that implemented and planned economic support measures and the realization of structural reforms promises swift post-crisis recovery, because we have some projections of World Bank, and in some way they are positive, and it gives us the hope that we will outcome this crisis with more or less success. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David. Thanks for your understanding and sharing a range of measures that Georgia has already introduced and tend to take. And we may come back to you if participants want to ask questions regarding what kind of challenges are being faced in the process as the Georgia.
I am so sorry. I have the next meeting with guests in our ministry, and after half an hour, I have to leave. I am very sorry.
We understand. Thank you. Thank you for your intervention.
Thank you.
Let me move to our next panelist. Let me invite Ms. Aygul Kusalieva, Director, Green Finance Intelligence, Astana International Finance Center, Green Finance Center. So, Ms. Aygul, the floor is yours. Kindly limit your initial intervention for 2, maximum 3 minutes, please. Thank you.
Of course. Good morning to everyone. Hello, Hamza Malik. It's nice to see you again. I remember meeting in Astana, and now we're in this online world. So it was really nice to hear the presentation, and I believe that they are aligned with the SDG agenda and is aiming actually to support those projects in this area. And from my perspective and from the perspective of AFC Green Finance Center, what I want to mention maybe here, that mobilizing financial resources actually requires some mechanism to decrease the investment risk and encourage the commercial finance providers to involve in the implementation of the projects within the SDG goals. And typically it's blended finance instruments, and mostly we know these guarantees instruments, but at the same time we're also kind of relying sometimes only on the government to fund those projects. But we need to understand that it's also not the way to go, because the government alone cannot, to bridge that gap in SDG financing. Therefore, there is another challenge I would like to bring here, that's the capital markets, where every day, on daily basis, trillions of dollars in developed markets, and I would say maybe millions, right, in developing economies being invested. Therefore, there is a challenge to green that, those fundings channeled through the capital markets. And that's the point I want to bring here today, because we're working here at AFC Green Finance Center basically to support that, support the ways, financing ways of green projects. And when we say green, it's not only about combating the climate change, it also has some kind of, social ingredient, let's say. Just recently here in Kazakhstan, we had the first issuance of green bonds. And the green bond was issued to support the small and medium enterprises working in renewable energy projects. Therefore, I would like to highlight that, in fact, although it was a way to, reduce those CO2 emissions and work in the agenda of Paris climate change, but at the same time, it's also creating new jobs, during the pandemic and covering that social issues. Therefore, I believe that there should be some, measures to support those projects, both from the government side, putting the rules and regulations in place, but at the same time, capital markets, going following those guidelines. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you so much. This was very clear, how to ensure that the government and the private sector come together to promote finance, in particular support of SDGs and development. And you share a few specific examples how investments are being aligned in that direction, including green bonds and stuff. Thank you, ma'am. Our next participants, I think we have some connection issues, so I'll continue moving down the line and we'll try to come back to Mr. Qadir later. But for now, let me request Ms. Gulnara Zuma Jaldiyeva, Deputy Chair, Federation of Trade Unions of Kazakhstan. Ms. Gulnara, what, in your opinion, is the role of trade unions, since you're in the midst of that, in helping to overcome the COVID-19 crisis? What are some of the specific concrete initiatives you have undertaken in Kazakhstan so far? So the floor is yours, Ms. Gulnara. Ms. Gulnara, you have to, I think, press the blue button on the right side to request to speak. That way you'll be accepted and we'll be able to have you on board. It's on the bottom right side of your screen, blue tab, request to speak. Okay, I see you're on board. Please go ahead.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon, distinguished participants of the conference. Today, the major goal faced by trade unions to overcome the crisis is to minimize social risks for workers, to prevent discrimination and violation of labor rights, and to preserve workplaces and jobs and all the payments. So from the first days, trade unions announced just its commitment to provide support to all citizens. During the pandemic, more than 4,000 applications and requests were received by the trade union. So mainly, those were related to all the debts and the arrears in payments and in wages, and delays, so to avoid violations of the workers' right. So we had hotlines and headquarters working with the trade unions. We are carrying out monitoring in the field of on the field of violating labor relations. Together with our partners, we work in drafting response measures. We just called on joining efforts to minimize risk and to stabilize situation, to prevent mass unemployment and delays in wage payment and social benefits payment, and ungrounded or just deterioration of labor conditions. All our workers took part in these hotlines and headquarters operations that were established in all regions of the country. In addition, in order to assess the contribution of medical staff who were involved into counteracting COVID-19, we submitted our proposals to the government. And
также мы внесли предложение о том, чтобы внести.
We also made a proposal to introduce COVID-19 as a professional industrial disease and expand the number of people who are subject of lump sum social allowances. We also initiated address to the government to keep vacancies and employment opportunities for most sectors of economy. Trade unions are also supporting their members since the beginning of the pandemic. Our trade union federation provided material support to its members. We procure PPEs and foodstuffs to the lower income families, medical practitioners families in particular. And at the moment, we are also focusing on the post coronavirus rehabilitation, although people are convalescent, but the long repercussions of COVID infections are still there, and that is why we need to be focused on rehabilitation of COVID survivors. Thank you.
Nara, I see another angle coming on putting the emphasis on the workers and unemployed people, and coming from your perspective from trade unions, very heartening to know that you have already shared specific proposals. I think this is an important issue. Unemployment and addressing the needs of people is going to be the critical thing. Assuming just economic recovery is going to take care of everything is not going to be enough. So thanks for reiterating the message for all of us. Let me move to our next panelist, Ms. Asal Kubanic-Bikova, founder, Women's Entrepreneurship Development Fund, Kyrgyz Republic. Ms. Asal, throughout the forum and also today in this session, we've heard about the importance of women, that they have been disproportionately affected by the COVID crisis. Similarly, in SME sector has been hit quite directly and mostly compared to other sectors. And again, there are several women entrepreneurs involved in that. You are part of a working group that is developing the national program on women entrepreneurship under the Ministry of Economy in Kyrgyzstan. So what specifically is being proposed in this national program, keeping in view the COVID-19 context in particular, and how can it help Kyrgyzstan achieve the sustainable development goals? So Mr. Asal, the floor is yours, please.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо огромное всем презентаторам, которые были сегодня на сессии. И в действительности...
Thank you. Thank you very much. And as we noticed, COVID-19 had a very bad impact on even before COVID inequality associated with women. 20-30% is the economic activity rate before COVID for women. before versus men, and of course SMEs are mostly vulnerable, and women are mostly employed in SMEs because a very small number of women employed by big corporations. So that is why the situation which we are facing now and all those challenges says that the interest of women are not taken into consideration in full scale. Recently, we drafted a report on the survey of business representation for women, which is not more than 50%. So that is why we need to expand women's representation in entrepreneurship associations. It is very important because the previous vice minister developed a national program last year for women's entrepreneurs, and now we have interdepartmental task force which is aimed to develop the respective broadening up economic opportunities for women. Currently, this program is just being drafted. And now I would like to dwell on which points we recommend to include. Many of our recommendations are consonant with Madam Azizova's presentation in terms of what we need to do. First of all, we need to develop infrastructure where at all levels we could support economic activities by women, and services should become more affordable for women. We could, for instance, establish preschooling institutions with the help of women in rural areas particular. We also try to train in digital skills our women, and our government should be focused on training for girls and women and of all ages, to train them all new skills to boost their employment opportunities, because currently women entrepreneurs are surviving, but the government should do their best in order to give an extra impetus to women, to let them become more active online, and for this they need to be exposed to digital skills. Access to financial resources is another important point, and unfortunately not all women entrepreneurs could make use of governmental measures, because usually these measures are not matched with the needed criteria for receiving this governmental support. As a matter of fact, we have a big number of challenges, burning challenges and issues, which of course I have no time to name all of them, but I wanted to highlight these main points. And wrapping up my small intervention, I just would like to say, yes, if we want to achieve SDGs and achieve equality, our government, first of all, and we also, first of all, should have a commitment on prioritizing SDGs, especially in gender equality. Thank you. Thank you.
Comprehensive, yet within 3 minutes or so response, and bringing back the importance of targeting vulnerable groups such as women. I think that's pretty important, and we're learning it, some repeated themes now emerging. Focus on work and employment, focusing primarily on women's role and from different angles. I'm glad you highlighted the importance of digital connectivity and how to familiarize them with the digital world so they can effectively participate. You couldn't talk much about the financing aspect, but I'm sure if we have opportunity, we can come back to you for that. My colleagues informed me that our panelist, which we missed earlier, may be available now. which is great. So let me try and do that. We have Mr. Kader Bekanov. He unfortunately, due to the connectivity problems, could not join us on Kudo, but I think we have him on the telephone. So may I request my colleague Natalia to facilitate if he can actually share his views with the participants over here. So over to you, Natalia.
Говорите. Спасибо за предоставленную возможность выступить на субрегиональном.
Thank you for having me at this sub-regional forum. Very briefly, I also would like to speak about the economic situation on behalf of Kazakhstan, which is very similar as in other countries with its own specificities. The current situation caused the deepest economic crisis as of the past 30 years. Most vulnerable layers of population now are even more vulnerable. These are SMEs, retail sector, aviation, mining, transport, servicing sectors, and of course, on this background, most players are trying to develop their own anti-crisis measures, strategic development plans. They're reviewing their situations versus banks and corresponding commitments on their loans. We managed to review governmental support measures and whether they were effective for the businesses, how businesses could overcome the situation, and the analysis proved that the governmental support measures are not enough and not correct sometimes. We need to be focused more on tax exemptions to provide soft loans. Of course, this could not be some static approach. It is a very dynamic process, ever changing, depending upon the situation. That is why we need to see whether the measures will be effective. COVID-19 is decreasing, however, the lockdown continues, and we need to see how our economy would further survive and how to provide employment to our people and to alleviate poverty and protect against poverty our population. In this regard, our employers' organizations play a crucial role in terms of social supporting the employees. With the support of ILO, we provide technical support to our businesses. We inform them about the current governmental support opportunities for the businesses, and that is why these activities are ongoing. They should be sustainable as well. And I also would like to say that, of course, GDP losses would be like minus 4.5%. Unemployment aggravated, and we have more and more low-income people.
Окей. Я тогда завершаю, жду следующих вопросов, которые будут.
Thank you, Mr. Kader, for taking the effort. I know you couldn't connect through the Kudo, but again, thank you for your patience and trying to convey your messages through the phone. Really appreciate your intervention here. I'm just running a bit behind. I would like to keep at least 20 minutes, 25 minutes for the question and answer session to give the opportunity to panelists if they want to ask any questions to the panelists. This was, by the way, Mr. Kader Bekanov, Chairman of the Board, Confederation of Employers, Entrepreneurs of the Republic of Kazakhstan, Chairman of the Board, Union of Engineering Companies of the Republic of Kazakhstan. So that concludes our first round of interventions from the panelists. And we already saw some, as I mentioned, few themes emerging, zeroing in and targeted recovery efforts, essentially, whether it's around women, whether it's around work, whether it's around trying to make sure we have a green recovery. We heard these sentiments expressed by presenters and then panelists. Let me now turn to the questions. We've already received a few questions from the audience. This is one question from Ms. Paulina Vinogradova, and she's not asking who the question is asked, so let me identify in a minute. The question is, what policy is efficient to limit amounts of plastic bags in cities? Effective practices seem to be taxes on plastics and fines. Taking the crisis into account, what are the alternatives? I think it's a very good question. This pertains to sort of the greening aspect of economic recovery. So if I first may request Ms. Lesia Nikolaeva to take the first response, and then I'll request any of the panelists, if they have any pertinent observation on this question, I'll be happy to have them on the panel. So Ms. Lesia Nikolaeva, if you want to respond to the question, she's asking about alternatives to taxes on plastics. Ms. Lesia, you have to request to speak, I think, so that we can get you on board. Thank you. I see it has happened. Please, the floor is yours.
Спасибо большое еще раз.
Thank you very much for the question, and I would try to just answer it. After signing back in 2019 addendum to Basel Convention on Waste Handling, special addendum was signed to prevent plastic waste, and specifically after that, countries take or pay more attention on plastic waste management, in particular disposal plastic bags. And we think that this instrument, this tool, addendum to Basel Convention, which is monitored by and executed by UNEP, will support countries in their efforts to prohibit and to dispose of using disposable plastic bags and plastic cups, plastic items. And the good practice, best practices shows that there is a list of 10 plastic items that many countries, including EU countries, integrated into their practice. And through technical practice, assistance by Basel Convention, countries can get such support and information. Therefore, I call on the colleagues to pay attention to the documents and events, as well as papers disseminated by Basel Convention working groups, and specifically in response to the new, or as a follow-up to the new addendum on plastic waste. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lesia. Do I hear anybody else wants to take a jab? Please identify, and if you want to have another insight coming from another colleague. I see Ms. Essel is raising her hand. Go ahead, Essel.
Спасибо большое. Я постараюсь очень коротко на примере периода.
Thank you very much. I will try to be brief. Based on COVID-19 consequences, we could see that many women lost their jobs. And last year, our government initiated draft law on prohibition to use plastic bags.
Good. Go ahead.
Да, мы сейчас реализуем проект по сокращению.
we are implementing a project aimed at shrinking usage of plastic bags in order to get together the efforts of entrepreneurs. And our women launched the initiative of sewing, just bags and selling them in supermarkets in Kyrgyzstan, so made of fabrics. And I think one of the solutions may be to encourage entrepreneurs and support entrepreneurs to produce green products or maybe environment-friendly products. And so partnerships will be developed in this regard. This is my brief comment. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you very much. Any other panelists, if they want to take the floor, they can request to speak and have the intervention. I'll wait for about 3 or 4 seconds just to see if I get any further comments on this particular question. Then we'll move on. I have 2 or 3 more questions already here. Okay, let this participant organize their thoughts. Let me, in the meantime, move to the next question. This is the question asked by Mr. Pradeep De. He's asking, is there any established model to ensure the well-being of vulnerable groups like women, single parents, etc.? So as before, let me request our presenters first, and then maybe one of the panelists can also jump in. So if I may request Ms. Nargis Azizova to respond to this question, and then if any panelists want to respond and add further insights, they'll be happy to do that. So Ms. Azizova, may I request you to please respond to this question?
Hamza, can you just specify, because the noise is really,
Sure.
It was noisy.
So let me repeat the question. It's from Mr. Pradeep De. He's asking, is there any established model to ensure the well-being of vulnerable groups like women, single parents, and other vulnerable groups such as these? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Спасибо большое за ваш вопрос, очень интересный.
Thank you very much for your question. It's rather interesting. I would say that there are practices which allow just addressing how it could be replicated in other regions, in other countries. The most important, so the lady does not use, the lady does not use headset, so there is an echo, and I can hear my translation there. So for us, it's an important issue which we call leadership. So this is just, these are women who participate in creating these models, thus understanding their needs and how it can work. And we provide technical and financial support for piloting such initiatives. Yes, we do have positive practices for each of such examples, and we are going to, and we would be glad to share them, particularly what relates to women with disabilities, women from vulnerable households of migrants, HIV positive women, and women, single mothers. So these are not just models, but these are best practices which can be rolled out.
Azizova. Any panelists would like to take or highlight another suggestion? Any other comment on the question asked? You can move to that now, please. Again, I'll wait. If you want, please press the blue button, request to speak. Any panelists, and we'll have you on board. And then you can go ahead. Again, I'll wait a few seconds. Okay, then move on to the next question, and this is identified to be addressed to Ms. Ramiro Pizarro. This question is from Callaway Sprinkle. They're asking, what are the largest structural barriers to improve youth employment, and how can governments encourage local economic participation in the North and Central Asian region instead of labor migration? So, Mr. Pizarro, this question is addressed directly to you. May I request you to please press the blue button to request to speak so we can get you on board, and then we can ask that you can respond to that question. I see you there. Thank you very much. If for your benefit, let me repeat the question. What are the... Sorry, did you get the question or should I repeat it?
The barrier for young people to get unemployment. Yes, there are different kind of barriers, no? I think the first one is how young people can find job opportunities that are in the market, but they don't know they are available. That's the reason that we work closely with the Public Employment Service to provide special attention to young people, to open the network of opportunities. Normally, young people get jobs through informal contact or related to the family network, but they don't know where the jobs are. So facilitating young people contact with job opportunity, that help to overcome one of the barriers. The second one, there is a big gap between the educational system and what are the skills that are demanded in the markets. To give more opportunities to young people, also go through giving them the opportunity to develop technical skill that can make them create more opportunities for the job that enterprise are demanding. So to close the gap between the formal education and the skill demanding of the market with target education, technical and vocational education, providing the right skill, that is another possibility of overcome the barrier that usually young people find in the labor market. There are a third one that I will mention, that is something that the employers always raise, is the lack of labor competence. Say they cannot hire young people, but they don't know how they will behave when they have a job. So open young people opportunities for having a first job is very important. And we also work closely with the Employment Service to develop a pilot program where the young people can have access to a first job and then start building a career. So I try to summarize, but these are the most common barrier and also the policies where we could address and overcome this barrier. Thanks for your question.
Thanks, Mr. Ramiro. Thank you very much. Very clear and quite detailed, I must say. Thank you so much. I think it will be interesting to get a perspective from the government side as well. May I request Mr. Bakhodir Umurzakov, the Deputy Minister for Employment and Labor Relations, to shed further light from his experience on the same question here. And the question essentially asking about what are the main structural barriers to improve youth employment, and how can government encourage local economic participation instead of labor migration? I think it's a very interesting, very good question. So, Mr. Umurzakov, if I may request you to please request to speak so we can have you on board. Thank you very much. I see you are there. Please go ahead.
Distinguished colleagues, I am Katerina Zagunova. I am the head of the Unit for International Cooperation. Regrettably, Mr. Umurzakov had to leave because of some important meeting, but if you allow me, I would answer this question that was asked by Mr. Moderator. Of course, structural changes and structural difficulties that were faced by all the governmental agencies during the pandemic include employment, ensuring welfare of the population, poverty reduction, and social welfare systems. And the ministry carried out big-scale works in order to improve the situation. By the decree of the President, anti-crisis unit was established aimed at overcoming negative effects. So it was jointly with the Ministry of Employment, and the Ministry of Employment carried out or launched broad-scale programs in the labor market that included such measures as subsidizing employment programs, development of entrepreneurship, individual land plot development, and enhanced social and public works programs. So they are rather popular in our country. And during the pandemic period, more than 200,000 people, including young people, women, were actively involved to social works or public works.
На рынке труда общественные работы, типы общественных работ были.
Due to pandemic, the volume of public works had been significantly expanded. Before pandemic, we have 5 to 7 types of employment through public works, but now it's up to 14, including support of social weak, social vulnerable population. We provide them with care services through this public works employment schemes. Mr. Omarzakov spoke about financial support to the vulnerable groups of population. I don't want to dwell on this, but we have the program of subsidizing household gardens, and we providing more opportunities for people to feed themselves with these household gardens. And we also established opportunities for agricultural cooperatives, which boosted significantly employment opportunities for village population. We will continue these practices of material stimulus provisioning, as well as providing additional employment opportunities in terms of giving conducive environment to our SMEs and micro entrepreneurship. Thank you.
For covering for Mr. Omarzakov, quite comprehensive, I must say. It's a very interesting question too, indeed. I see we have gone about 2 or 3 minutes over our allotted time, but the conversation is going on, and I have and one more question. Actually, at least let me allow one more question, if you indulge me. And I think Ms. Aigul Kuselieva would be most appropriate to respond to this question, given the nature of the question. The question here is, how can green finance contribute to recovery after the pandemic in the sub-region? And what are some practical measures to promote and expand green financing in the North and Central Asia? I know in your remarks earlier you covered some of these aspects, but here's an opportunity to expand a bit further if you want. So Ms. Saigul, if you can, I see you have gone to that. The floor is yours, ma'am. Thank you.
Sure, thank you for this question to the audience. And going back to the green finance, actually it's a very important topic right now, because we know these current developments in the EU zone, that the recovery should be green, and we're also supporting this idea here in Kazakhstan, and of course, these developments in the region. And going back to what we're doing here right now in Kazakhstan, from the perspective of the AFC Green Finance Center, we're involved now in the legislative initiatives to support the green projects by providing them special subsidies from the government side. As I mentioned in my previous comment already, we cannot rely heavily on the government, because the government spendings are going to be huge right now due to the pandemic pandemic. But at the same time, the government should exercise those fiscal policy tools it has, to enhance the recovery to be green, let's say. And in that sense, right now we are seeing the subsidies to the small and medium enterprises as a way to support the recovery to be green. And now we are proposing to include, we have this, special program called, what's the name of the roadmap for the for enterprises, for business, like if I translate it from Kazakh or Russian. So the special program provides subsidies which covers the interest rate for the credits and the coupon rates for the bonds issued by the small and medium enterprise in Kazakhstan. Right now we're working on inclusion of the special economic activities which are aiming to the green recovery in the list of businesses which will be supported by this program. And we're expecting to have around from 5 to 7% of the portfolio of this program to be green. So we expect that those small medium enterprises in Kazakhstan, which will be supported by these subsidies, they will be implementing green projects like for this amount. And we know that in developed countries, actually, the amount in green financing in the whole economy can go up to 20-30%, and it's around 10% or maybe even less in emerging economies. And we have that goal to get to the point when it can be 10%, let's say, or 7%, and can go further without any support from the government. Right now, we're aiming this 5-7%. And going back to the question, I'm just providing the example, to have the background that, in fact, if every government gives put the goal, to have this recovery green and see those projects which can be green, to help the economy to recover, and put those measures the one which I was saying, fiscal policy tools. There must be some other ways, let's say taxation, which is more appropriate maybe in some other economies. Put those regulations in place. It can also help in terms of if we consider emerging economies of Central Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Aigul, for the very comprehensive, very detailed, very thorough, and very pertinent response. I think there's a lot of potential actually to be channeled through this area. Like you rightly said, the fiscal positions of the governments will be quite tight, so they will need the support and participation from the private sector. That's excellent. I have been asked one more question, actually. I received one more question. I am very conscious of the time. I know people have commitments, but I think this is an interesting question. It's going back to Mr. Ramiro Pizarro. And the question is asked from Narges Guliyeva. And she's asking, to what extent the COVID-19 crisis will accelerate the transition to the green jobs in the Central Asian countries, in the countries in transition? Ms. Nargis Guliyeva is from UNDP, Azerbaijan. So, Mr. Romero, again, and repeat the question for your benefit. To what extent the COVID-19 crisis will accelerate the transition to green jobs in the region? Mr. Romero, I see you have accepted. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you all agree that it's a very important question, but it's so early to assess and to predict. So all will depend how the government are developing what the ILO call this employment strategy for a job-rich recovery. If they invest at the same time creating jobs that are green job or environmental friendly. If, as an example, Uzbekistan, for instance, the official inform us that they have a huge public work program, how they link this public work program to recovery of environmental resource, how they use this public work program for transition to a green economy. So I think the response finally will depend of the critical decision that the government have to take in the following months and how to link this employment support program, how to link the fiscal policies to investment and to jobs that can facilitate the transition. But it's not clear because we are in an early stage. I think in the coming months, when we see more clear decision, just to give an example, we learned yesterday that in France, there is huge economic package for reactivating the economy, like 100 million of euros. Is the biggest package in the French history. And 1/3 of this package, the fiscal package, is 1/3 is 60% is clearly focused and facilitating the transition to a green economy. That is a good example how fiscal policies can stimulate the economy, but at the same time earmarking investment and job creation for this transition. And the same happening with you look, for instance, new investment, and I mentioned before, in developing new skill and new profession. But we need to target this skill or this profession, and profession that can create the strength for this transition to green economy. So there are some countries that have a clear signal. Others are taking the decision. So in the region, I think it's a little bit early to say and to predict. Thanks.
Thanks, Amiro. Thanks again for very, very insightful observation. I think you're absolutely right. It's a bit too early, but early signs, and you gave a very specific example. Some early signs are there. And this is indeed what needs to happen, what must happen. You cannot just throw fiscal money and try and recover, as I was saying earlier as well, and other colleagues have highlighted. You have to make sure the transition actually helps us move to a better world, better economy. I think you highlighted very well. It can be done. There are few examples that are emerging, and more countries need to be encouraged on that front. I think let's now try to move towards the closure. We are 10 minutes over, but that's okay. We have some very, very interesting questions which try to mesh together the main theme areas, women's role in the economy and the recovery, how to make sure the jobs are there for women, and then how to make sure the jobs actually move towards the green sector. So it was a nice interactive kind of questions, helped us understand the overall picture much more clearly. I'd like to actually, I'm not trying to summarize the main remarks and themes of everyone, but let me share this very nice quote from famous Indian author Arundhati Roy. She's just one small para, and that to me conveys the entire gist of our conversation very, very clearly. And I quote here, the COVID-19 pandemic has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past, and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. End of quote. I think that's the doomsday machine that she's referring to is a very, very single-minded focus on only economic growth, GDP growth, at the cost of leaving people out, at the cost of leaving vulnerable people out, at the cost of not investing in social protection, at the cost of ignoring environment concerns, and so on and so forth. And this is what we learned. Let's make COVID-19 an opportunity to try and make sure we build a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable economy in this sub-region. On this note, let me thank all our speakers for very clear, insightful, focused presentations, and all the presentations, all the panelists actually, for staying with us throughout these 2 hours, and in some cases they actually took questions as well, but more importantly, for sharing your observations, for sharing your insights, your experiences is much valued. I'm sure it enriched the experience of the participants over here. So to wrap up, I will now hand over to my colleague, Natalia. It's adios from my side. Thank you very much once again. And thanks for the opportunity for moderating this session. Natalia, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Hamza, and congratulations. This has been indeed a very, very interesting session that touched on a lot of very pertinent points, because as you just pointed out, of course, all pillars of the Sustainable Development Goals need to be engaged equally in order to make the recovery truly inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. So yeah, it was wonderful. It was a pleasure to listen. So I would just want to make two housekeeping announcements. Number one, we will put the link to an evaluation questionnaire into the YouTube chat for people that have joined us via YouTube. Please do take the time to evaluate the session, because this helps us to make future meetings better. And also we want to hear your view, what you thought about the session here. And I would also like to invite all of you to join our next session, which will happen at 2 o'clock Almaty time, and which will be on supply chains and connectivity and the role of regional partnerships as we move out of COVID and into a transition to sustainable development. All the links to the sessions can be found on the ESCAP event webpage, which is also being posted into the YouTube chat now. There you can also see recordings from previous sessions. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you in the afternoon.